the broadcast. Can I just have the Secretariat confirm that broadcast is ready to go?
Yep. Yes, broadcasting is ready.
Okay. So I declare open this public hearing of the PFAS Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee, Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade in Canberra and online. These are public proceedings and we welcome all who are listening to proceedings online. The committee today will hear from researchers involved in the Australian National University's PFAS health study, which recently published its final reports. The committee has a long-standing interest in this study and looks forward to discussing the findings and recommendations, as well as potential areas for future research areas on PFAS and health. Before we move to opening statements and discussions, I need to advise of some formalities. I remind witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated as a contempt of Parliament. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to the committee. In accordance with the committee's resolution at the start of the 46th Parliament, this hearing is being broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website in due course. Those present or listening to the proceedings are reminded that recording is permitted and that there is a requirement to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. Mobile phones should be switched to off or on silent. To assist Hansard in providing an accurate record of meetings, members of the committee and witnesses should identify themselves when they speak. I will now welcome witnesses from the ANU PFAS health study. To assist Hansard, I would first ask witnesses to identify themselves by name and position only at this stage.
Professor Martin Kirk at the Australian National University.
Rosemary Porter, Associate Professor at the Australian National University.
Sadie Law, Research Fellow. And Kayla Smurthwaite, Research Fellow at the Australian National University.
Nina Lazarevic, Research Fellow at the Australian National University.
Thank you. I now invite a brief opening statement of up to 5 minutes before we proceed to discussion.
Okay, thanks very much. My name is Martin Kirk, as I just introduced. I'm the lead investigator of the PFAS health study. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we're meeting here in Canberra, which is the Ngunnawal people. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect and honour to the traditional owners of the lands on which you're meeting as well. So we've appeared before this committee before to discuss the PFAS health study, and we agreed to come back when we completed our studies. And we did have a delay of around about a year, mainly due to COVID. A couple of reasons for that. Our staff were involved in COVID and were deployed to COVID, and we were also unable to travel to the field and properly engage with community and local health practitioners. So I know we've talked about the particular studies in the previous committee, but just to recap, we conducted a systematic review of the medical literature to begin with, so we could identify what health effects we felt were most important to study, and there have been many different studies into the health effects of PFAS. I think it's fair to say that the literature is very confusing, because many studies find an association with high levels of PFAS and then others don't. So it was very important for us to start on that basis. We then developed a protocol and conducted 4 separate studies, the first of which was a focus group study looking at the lived experience of people in the 3 communities, Williamtown, New South Wales, Oakey, Queensland, and Katherine, Northern Territory. That was published in 2018. And then what we're here to talk about today is 3 studies, and we have the lead investigators for those particular studies. So the epidemiologists that did the work in those. So I think we'll be able to ask some specific questions. And also Rosemary Corder, who led the data linkage component, which was extensive and comprehensive look at rates of disease in these communities. So the three studies were the blood serum study, which was looking at were levels higher in people living in these communities, some of the reasons for that. The second was a survey of residents to identify whether people self-reported health and also their level of psychological distress. And then lastly, the data linkage study, which actually consists of three separate studies, one looking at perinatal outcomes for mothers and babies living in these particular towns, and then another one on adolescent or on child development. So you repeat surveys and looking at whether they had higher rates of poor outcomes. And then finally, a study looking at cancer and mortality. So what did we find? And I've seen reports in the news that we didn't find things. Well, I think in some ways that's a good thing. But just to summarise what our conclusions were from all of those studies, and you'll see the reports on our website are quite extensive. So overall, we identified there was clear evidence of elevated blood serum concentrations of PFAS in residents and workers. Those three PFAS affected communities. And there was also increased psychological distress in those three exposed communities. When we looked at the incidence of other adverse outcomes, we certainly saw higher rates of some adverse health outcomes and diseases in these communities. But in general, there wasn't consistency across the three different townships. And where we did find them, we haven't seen good prior evidence for them in the literature. I think you need to have a good look at the reports to understand some of the intricacies of the way that we approached the studies. They took us a long time to prepare and conduct. Where we did find some things which were consistent with the international literature, we did identify an association between high PFAS blood levels and elevated serum cholesterol levels, which is something we did find in the systematic. I think I will leave it there. That's just a summary of our findings, and I'll just open it up to questions from the committee.
Thank you. Senator McCarthy, did you want to lead off with any questions?
Thank you, Chair, and yes, thank you to all witnesses from the ANU for being available today, but also for being able to conduct your study and give us some more information to work with, but also an opportunity to ask questions. I'm coming to you from Larrakia country here in Darwin, and I certainly pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging here. Professor, thank you for that. I have a lot of questions, and I'm mindful that my colleagues also have quite a few questions. So I might just go straight into the component 3 section of your studies in terms of the cross-sectional survey. And I'm interested to know that you did the comparison, obviously, for here in the Northern Territory. You chose Alice Springs as your comparison community. And I'm just looking at your summary here in front of me that it says here, compared to participants from Alice Springs, a high proportion of Katherine participants reported cancer and liver disease. Just wondered if you could, for the benefit of our committee, explain a little bit more in detail about that comparison and whether there should be further studies in regards to some of these health differences.
Well, maybe I'll just give a brief answer, and Nina might like to add something,
Sure.
and Rosemary. So I think it's important to recognise with the cross-sectional survey, first up, that people in the exposed communities that participated were self-selected in that they were people that were recruited through the blood testing, and only about a third of people who actually did blood testing ended up completing a survey. So that means that you might get people who have higher incidence of disease than what you might get in the general community. We chose Alice Springs, and in Alice Springs, the way we recruited people into that study, in that comparison town, was to randomly select people from Medicare. So I think while we saw higher rates of disease, higher prevalence of disease in Katherine compared to Alice Springs, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the experience of Katherine as a community and Alice Springs as a community. And I think probably a more accurate representation is the data linkage study, but maybe I might just ask Neil for a response.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Ms. Lazarevic?
Thank you. I think the important thing to note is that the prevalence of cancer was not associated with higher PFAS levels in these people. In fact, we found that the people with higher PFAS levels had lower prevalence of these cancers. Other than that, I think it's important to note the selection bias that could be occurring there because it is a cross-sectional survey.
Can I just ask you that selection bias, can you just explain what that means? I guess I heard a little bit of what the professor said at the beginning, but I take it you're referencing that to the recruitment through the blood testing?
Correct. So people chose to participate in the survey, and the people that chose to participate in the survey may have been more likely to be those ones that have cancer and are concerned about their exposure to PFAS, rather than a random sample like we did in the comparison communities. So this has the potential to affect our estimates of cancer prevalence in those areas. But
would you have asked that question in your survey? Would you have asked participants, did they already have cancer or have had experience with cancer?
We did ask that question, yes. I would like to refer, though, to Professor Corder, because we did a much more extensive analysis of cancer outcomes in the data link study. In the cross-sectional survey, we've had very few cancer cases, so it's not a very reliable analysis of cancer in comparison with the data linkage study, where we had 35 or so years of historical records. Thank you.
So that's, sorry, I'm trying to understand that, Ms. Lazarevic. So you're saying that with the data linkage, there might have been a slightly different outcome? I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood you there.
Yes, it's a more reliable analysis.
The data linkage? Correct.
We had a large sample size. I would prefer to let Professor Corder address that if it's okay. If you're
okay, sure. Professor Corder?
Yeah, sure. So again, just to reiterate, with the survey, it's not a random, well, we tried to randomly sample the community, but it's not a necessarily random sample community. It's volunteers only, so they might report things more or less in the community, we don't know, than the whole community. And it's self-reported conditions. It's also reports on conditions that people have at the time or in the past, right? So we're not capturing everybody who's ever lived in these areas over the time that people have been potentially affected by PFAS. What the data linkage study does, it's quite different. It uses historical records and they're things like cancer registry data, and we link it up to historical address records. So we can actually get a sample of most people we think we've captured who have lived in any of these three communities, going back to as far as records go back, which is about 1984. And we link it to these other databases. So we can actually calculate rates of cancers as far as they're recorded in these databases. Now, cancer registrations are notifiable in Australia, so we believe we capture most cancers that are diagnosed in Australia that way. So what we did in this study, we didn't measure PFAS levels. What we're essentially doing is comparing rates of cancers in people who have lived in these PFAS communities, and we have comparison communities where we look at rates using the same methods in comparison communities. I will point out that comparison communities are not the same communities that were done in the surveys. They were just based on postcodes that we selected that were similar in profile to the PFAS communities.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just unpack that a bit, Ms. Corder? So your study was on cancer, and you went back to 1984 in terms of historical documents for Katherine, for Oakey, and for Williamtown. And did you at any point, because you had comparative communities, did you also look at those communities as well?
Yes, exactly. So we used the same methods. So essentially, we had two groups of people. By linking addresses, we could have two groups of people who we could pick up in historical address records that had ever lived in these communities back to 1984. We were using Medicare Consumer Directory database, so they keep historical records. As good as those records are, obviously, if people don't notify Medicare when they move, that won't be picked up in the record. But we do have historical records for most people in Australia. Most people are registered Medicare, not everybody. And then we can choose from those comparison postcodes. Again, these are de-identified data. We don't know who these people are, but we can select people who have lived in the comparison communities over the same period of time. And what we then do is, and we also link it to death data, so we know when people have died, so we know that they can't develop cancer if they've already died, for instance. But using those data, we can estimate rates of cancers in the three communities, Katherine, Williamtown, Oakey, and in the three comparison communities or groups in the areas. And so that's what we did to compare a number of candidate outcomes. It included other things, not just cancers, but while we're talking about cancer, I'll concentrate on that for now. So we looked at 23 different groups of cancers in that study. Would you like me to go on and explain the results?
No. Can I just take you just on this line of questioning? So, in the interest of those who might be listening and watching this, but haven't read the report, what were your comparisons for the town of Katherine around that historical data in relation to cancer?
So in Katherine, we had, of all the 23 different groups of cancer we looked at, we found one where the rates were higher in Katherine compared to the comparison communities, and that was prostate cancer.
They were just different postcodes in the NT. So,
Sorry, Professor, I'm having trouble hearing you. I heard Ms. Corder really clearly. I'm not sure if it's...
Sure. So there was a range of different postcodes where populations were selected from for comparison purposes.
Okay, but in this instance, Katherine, and just correct me if I didn't hear you right, Ms. Corder, Katherine was higher with prostate cancer as a result of your data linkage. Is that what you said?
That's right. So when we looked at the rates of cancer, they had higher rates of prostate cancer in Katherine compared to the comparison communities. And that's after we take into account differences in age and sex of the population.
And how much higher is the prostate cancer in Katherine that you found?
In Katherine, if we look at what we call a relative rate, so we look at how many times higher it is, and we found a rate that's 1.76 times higher in Katherine than the comparison communities.
And what do you put that down to, that higher rate?
Yeah. So this would be true for all the cancer outcomes we looked at. You've got to consider other possibilities, and with these sort of studies. I make it clear these are observational data. It's not an experiment, so we're observing what's going on, and there could be alternative explanations. So when we look at the results, the things we consider are, could there be other reasons that prostate cancer rates are higher in these communities? And it could be that there are other things linked to cancer that increase your risk of prostate cancer, such as family history, that we can't account for in the data. So we don't know whether, for instance, people in Katherine were more likely to have a family history of prostate cancer than people that didn't. So we just don't know, all right? So we can say the rates are higher. It could be due to other factors that aren't related to PFAS. The other thing is we look at is strength of association. And what we mean by that is the stronger that association is, that the higher that number is, that 1.76, if that was, 2, 3, 4, the stronger that number is, the more confident we would feel that that really is causally associated with that. We would call this a small to modest association. The other thing we take into account is consistency of the findings. So when you look across the 3 towns using the same methods, we found it in Katherine, we did not find the same thing in Oakey, and we did not find the same thing in Williamtown. The other thing we look at is there consistency with prior evidence? So again, going back to the prostate cancer specifically is what you asked about, is that there have been other studies that have looked at, do people living in these communities or is high PFAS levels associated with prostate cancer? And no previous studies have found this to be the case, with one exception in a subgroup of people who had a family history of prostate cancer. They found they were more likely to have prostate cancer if they lived in a PFAS.
So what other cancers came up in your research after prostate cancer?
Yeah, sure. So that was the only one for Katherine. So in Oakey, of the 23 groups we looked at, we found higher rates of laryngeal cancer in Oakey than in Williamtown. And I will stress there that this was a fairly rare outcome, but we did still find elevated rates. In terms of so the same conditions apply when we try and link it to say, well, what does that mean for causality? We can't prove or disprove it. But again, we didn't find that in the other towns. In terms of previous evidence for laryngeal cancer, there are no previous studies that have found that link to date.
Okay. Sorry, can I just ask, what, with the date 1984, your purpose for going to 1984, not beyond that? Do you want to just let the committee know the importance of that date?
Yes, sure. So 1984 is the starting date, not the end date. And the reason we started at that date is because that's when the historical address records start in Medicare. So we could start the clock, if you like, from that date. Again, not everybody in the data will be captured from that date. It depends when they move into an area. So anyone that moved into a PFAS area and that address is recorded on Medicare, we could start observing their data. Again, this is all de-identified data. We don't know who these people are. We just know they've lived in this area. And we know a little bit about their age and sex, for instance.
Okay.
So anytime someone moves in, and we follow them as far as we have the data. And the cancer data, we had the data up to 2017 for this study. And that's, I will qualify that though, for one of the databases, the cancer registrations for Northern Territory, they started a bit later. Is that correct? I'll just check if that here. I've got Sadie with me. So with cancer registrations, dates have made it mandatory at different times. So for, I'm just checking exactly when they go back. For 2 of them, they go back right back to before 1984. So we could follow them from 1984. And for one of the states, I think it's Northern Territory, you might not go back as far. No, that's okay.
I think one of the important facts is that the data linkage study is really looking for rates of disease in people who had ever lived in these towns and compared them with people who had never lived in these towns. It didn't look at blood levels of PFAS. It's really looking at whether people who had lived there had a higher level, a higher rate of disease.
Sorry, just to, sorry about that fact with the data linkage. So with the cancers of Northern Territory, we could only track cancers for from 1991. That's when the cancer registry data started. I think can I just clarify one other point when we went back to Katherine, the prostate cancer, which is probably an important point, is that even though we use comparison postcodes, and the way we selected those postcodes were, we tried from the ABS, looked at similar profiles in terms of how remote these communities were, the socioeconomic profile of these communities, and the proportion of Indigenous residents. You can't get that exact. And when we actually had the samples in the end from this study, we actually found a much larger proportion of Aboriginal people or Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people in Atherton than in the comparison population. We really need to keep that in mind too as being a different factor why rates could be different.
Okay, Ms. Corder, I think I also cut you off in terms of Williamtown. You were going to give a response around what you found in Williamtown. You mentioned the cancer for Oakey. Was there something you were going to mention there too before I cut you off? I apologise.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so in Williamtown, there were, of all the cancers we looked at, we found 2 were elevated, the rates were elevated. That was for kidney cancer and for lung cancer in Williamtown. So just going back in terms of the consistency of the evidence, again, Williamtown was the only town where we found lung cancer and kidney cancer to be elevated. We didn't find these in the other 2 towns. The evidence, prior evidence on lung cancer, there is no evidence before to say that it's linked to PFAS. Again, emphasising that absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence, but we just don't have prior evidence of this. With kidney cancer, the prior evidence is mixed. So there are some studies that have found associations with PFAS and some that haven't. So this contributes to the evidence that we did find elevated rates of kidney cancer in one community, and that is partly consistent with the previous.
Okay, Chair, I'm conscious my colleagues have questions, so I'm happy to stop here for now.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Senator McCarthy. Ms. Swanson, did you have some questions?
I do. Thanks for that, Chair. And thank you, one and all, from the study from the ANU for joining us today. I just wanted to go back to the initial desktop study that was done. Was that a study of all of the international literature? I know there is a lot, but was it, for example, did that take into consideration studies like the C8 study, which is potentially one of the biggest studies that has come out of America over, the last 30 years? Did that take that into consideration?
Yes, it did. Thank you. So the systematic literature review took into account, we used a standardised framework for searching the literature and also for studies that had been published and also those that hadn't. And so it did take into account studies like the C8 study. It's worth noting also that the C8 study had a much higher level of contamination of communities seen in the blood of participants, and it was a different chemical. It was PFOA as opposed to PFOS and PFHXS, which is what we found here in Australia.
But there would have been PFOA used here in Australia as part of that suite of chemicals. So was that part of your consideration as well?
Yeah, look, when we look at the blood serum results, and if you see in component 2, the blood serum study, you'll see that the PFOA levels in people's blood in these townships was at a similar concentration to those in the comparison community. Whereas for PFOS and PFHXS, the concentrations were 2 to 6 times higher in these particular exposed towns. Our understanding is that the firefighting foams that we used were largely containing PFOS and PFHXS.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So just going back, then in a lot of the literature that people talk to me about from the community, they talk about immunosuppression. And I just wanted to get to this because it's very interesting to talk about doing the study of cancer using Medicare data sets and matching people who have ever lived in those areas with people who haven't. one of the interesting things that people raise with me, and I would be interested to know how the webinar that you held last week went. We can get to that in a minute, and what some of the main questions were that people asked. But one of the ideas that seems to be in communities, and people have raised concerns with me, is that indeed this suite of chemicals in some studies have shown to be immunosuppressors. So rather than there being a direct causal linkage, using the example of prostate cancer, just as a example, that in different individuals and even in different areas that may have different other environmental cues, if you like, disease can manifest in different ways. So there may not be a uniformity in, people that have had exposure to the chemicals having a particular disease, even though, in the C8 study, they did find higher levels of cholesterol. They found some linkage, I believe, to kidney cancer. I think there was also some linkage to testicular cancer and other things. But there is the thought in the community that this suite of chemicals is an immunosuppressor. So therefore, illness presentation comes back to individuals and how their bodies react to the chemicals. Was there any thought given to that? And following on from that, what further research as a result of this research would you like to see conducted?
Look, thank you. So in the systematic review, we did look at immunological effects of PFAS. I think it's very difficult to study. There have been a handful of studies that looked at the reaction to vaccines in people with higher PFAS levels compared to those with lower PFAS levels. And we found limited evidence that there was some potential impact. It's hard to say whether it actually results in low enough immune response to actually mean that people are more likely to get infected. Mm-hmm. I know there's been some studies since the systematic review we published, some of which have found immunological effects, but they're very mixed. Like I really, when I look at those studies, they will find an association for one group, for one particular vaccine, and then not for another, and then the next paper will find some other vaccine. So I have to say, I'm not dismissing it, but I just think that that we don't see consistency there. Right. It's certainly something that does need further study. We couldn't address it in the study in the way that we did it, because what you really need to do is look at people who are about to be vaccinated. And in fact, COVID-19 probably presents an opportune time when people are being vaccinated, and you can compare people as they get vaccinated, pre and post vaccination, for their PFAS levels. So I think that is something that's potentially worth considering. But yeah, look, when I look at the literature, it's not particularly convincing from my perspective.
Right. So I'm just a little confused there with how vaccination comes into this, Martin. I'm not following on. So basically, a lot of people in our community are saying, look, we think that then they haven't found a causal link to any particular cancer because different individuals, may have a genetic predisposition to forming X cancer, whereas someone else might have a predisposition to forming something else, that their exposure to PFAS broadly may manifest in another way in a different individual because of the immunological responses. That's one of the I suppose the thoughts that's circulating in my community. So people are, thinking along those lines. So I'm certainly not dismissing what you said, but I'm just a little confused as to how immunisation comes into that, Martin.
Yeah, sorry. I was thinking you were talking about immunological response and the way that they have studied it in the literature is through vaccines. There have also been studies looking at increased rates of allergy and infectious disease outcomes. But as I said, it's not very convincing, but maybe Rosemary can speak to that point about individual responses and development of cancer, if that's what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yes, that's
and
exactly what I'm
of
talking
course,
about.
yeah, and that would be true of many diseases. We have a lot of individual variation, and why do some people get sick and not others? So in terms of epidemiological studies, we can't answer that for individuals. What we're really doing is looking at what we average effects, and so there is variation in there. The only thing that we assume, and it's very hard to totally assume this in an observational study, is that those susceptibility to cancer is roughly similar in the PFAS towns to your comparison towns. We don't know, and it's very hard to prove or disprove that. So again, we talk about average effects. We don't talk about individual effects in these studies.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the findings, while we wouldn't necessarily think that they were intended to find cause, because cause in health and medicine is a very big discussion topic. What we can do is contribute to the body of knowledge that is useful for both communities and government, and also to the scientific literature. And I think that there are many studies like these ones that we conducted going on overseas, and they will find similar results. And when you put the results we've got together with all of those, then you might see a clearer pattern emerging, like we tried to do in the systematic group. So
Okay.
I think it's very important to keep that in mind. If we saw, like as Rosemary said before, if we saw very strong associations across the three communities, we would be going, we would be very concerned, but we didn't really see that.
Okay. So then can I ask you about the webinars that were conducted with the communities that participated last week? What were some of the questions and concerns that came out of those?
We had around about 180 registrations, and about 60 people or groups actually ended up on the webinar. We had, in general, a pretty good sort of range of questions. They were relating to, can you guys remember any of the questions? Like, Kayla?
So I've got a copy of some of the questions here, and just before I start, we're currently developing responses to all of these questions, which will be on our website shortly, in addition to some other frequently asked questions from the community. Some participants asked about the mental health impacts and whether or not they were related to PFAS levels in people's bloods. Other people asked, yep.
And there was a range of others as well, and we're very happy to take questions as well and respond to them in writing.
So it might be worthwhile once those once you've compiled the answers to those community questions, I think that they would be a useful addendum to the committee's body of evidence. So when that's done, if I could ask you to provide that to the committee, obviously that might take a while, but I think that's a useful thing that we have that as well. Now, the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, in your opinion, what is the next? Are you satisfied with what you've achieved with this research, and is there more research that you believe you would like to conduct? What future research would be helpful in your view in relation to answering some of those questions from the community and forming a more solid opinion about the impacts of this suite of chemicals on people?
Well, I guess maybe I'll start, and I'm happy for others to contribute. From my perspective, I'm really satisfied that we finished this, and it was a huge body of work. I think it is a incredibly difficult problem these communities are facing. The environmental persistence is the big issue, and the fact that it stays in the human body for several years is the concern. When we devised a range of different studies to look at it. We're observing what's happened in these communities. I think it's worth noting that NHMS, the National Health and Medical Research Council, has funded 10 different studies looking at other aspects like male fertility and a range of other particular questions. And I think one of the studies which we are involved with is that led by the University of Queensland, where they're looking at changes over time, because there have been quite marked declines in blood PFAS levels over time. That's reassuring. But I think there's a need to conduct ongoing surveillance of that type to see what happens over time. I think it's very difficult to conduct high quality health studies in these towns where the populations are relatively small and the outcomes are rare. And so I think the communities, and also we found that while PFAS levels in blood were elevated, they weren't anywhere near as high as some of the studies have found overseas, like say in the Swedish studies or the Italian ones or C8 study. They weren't as high as those. So I think there'll be lots of research conducted in the US at the moment. There are many communities that are doing similar investigations, and I think that will be important to watch. Yeah, I'm not really sure where I would take what we've done. I'd be open to suggestions from others. Any comments?
I would just reiterate what Martin said, that I think the sense from even the community webinar is that people want the answer, and I understand that this is very difficult. And the recognition before we even went on this study that you won't come up with the answer, it contributes to the evidence, the overall body of evidence, both locally and internationally. I can speak to the data linkage study. Would we do any further? We had used all the available records that go back, as I said, to 1984. And there's probably nothing else we could do in that study to improve that study as it is. And the only thing you might want to consider a fair way into the future, do you want to update the linkage? We had cancer data to the end of 2017. Do you want to extend that? But again, a lot of the cancers you look at, they're small community, they're not common, so it might add a little bit, but I don't think that's the main direction of future research.
I think what is also reassuring is that people have changed behaviour in terms of using bore water, eating locally grown produce, and exposure to firefighting foams, and that will have the major impact. The blood PFAS concentrations will go down over time, and I think that's where the focus should be.
Thank you. And just a final question. So what action would you expect the Department of Health to take as a result of your findings and your report? You've just mentioned them, Martin, about exposure pathways being reduced. So is that something that you would recommend continue? Where are we at really in terms of that?
Well, look, I think it's not really my job to recommend on behalf, recommend to government per se. But what I would say is important is that both the community and government work out what kind of measures should stay in place. Like, is it, I think it's worth definitely considering that, the foods that are high risk and whether the water is still at risk, because, these are long-lasting chemicals in the environment, and so I think that's a discussion for community government to have and come to those conclusions. It's not, it's hard for me to recommend those kind of actions going forward.
This was raised at the webinar too last week, and the Department of Health did answer some of those questions. So it'll be on the recording, the transcripts of that webinar too.
The webinar is online on our website as well. We recorded it, so and our answers to questions. It also had panel members, so one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers and one of the Principal Medical Advisors, or two of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers actually, and so they responded to some questions from the community. Well, so it would be worth the committee review.
Okay, and just finally, are you so you're quite satisfied with the research that has been conducted to this point in your findings, and saying, you know, that really from what you've found you can't find linkages? Is that really what people generally are taking from this? Is that your findings, or am I reading that the wrong way?
Well, I think in terms of health effects, we would say there's limited evidence of health effects. That's our bottom line. But I think it's really important to put that in context, that we did find evidence of elevated PFAS levels in blood in community members overall. And I think that's really important. We also, you know, and I think we also identified the risk factors for people having higher levels of PFAS, which is drinking bore water, eating foods, locally grown foods, and living for a long time in these areas or working with the foams. But I think there were some associations in different towns, but they were inconsistent. So we can't draw any conclusions that they were due to PFAS.
Right. So do you think that one distinction that we can draw from this is potentially it isn't a good idea for people to be living in these areas where there are known exposure pathways for a long time?
I wouldn't say that at all. I can't really make recommendations about safety. I think that's, you know, really a job for local state departments of health and EPA and others. My perspective on it is I think the jury is still out on the safety of these chemicals in the longer term. And I note that there's, you know, many international bodies that are looking at it. They review evidence that is from animal and human toxicological studies. So I think the jury is still out, but from what I can, you know, we can't observe health effects, and we did the best we could look at the problem. You know, I can't think of any other way of doing what we did. There's probably some things we could have done better in retrospect, and I think you always feel like that. But we had really fantastic people on this team. We had Bruce Armstrong, we had Robin Lucas, we had Jochen Muller, we had some really incredibly good people working with us, and I can't think of other ways of doing it. It was a really complicated study and very difficult. What do you think, Rosemary?
I just want to clarify a point Martin made, which I think you'll agree with me.
Yeah,
when we
sure.
say we didn't observe health effects, well, we actually did find, again, higher rates of some conditions, and particularly in the data linkage study. As I said, we looked at 48 different sets of outcomes. We looked at across 3 communities, 144 different outcomes, which is a lot. And we found 12 had higher rates. I think the message we've got here is that we can't say that the high rates are caused by the PFAS. We go through the steps in detail in the report, and I would hope that people would read that detail who really want to know about this, around some of the discussion around whether those high rates are suggestive of a causal link or less suggestive of a causal link. We can't prove it, but I think, again, we're not saying there are no effects. We're saying we have very limited evidence in this study of those effects.
Yeah, and I do agree with that.
And so, sorry, what were those 12?
Okay, so we looked at 4 groups of outcomes. One was the perinatal outcomes, one was child development outcomes, the others were cancers, and the others were deaths from some specific causes. For the perinatal outcomes, we found in Williamtown that women were more likely to have heavy bleeding in childbirth, and they're more likely to have high blood pressure in Williamtown than the comparison communities. In Oakey, there were higher rates of stillbirth than the comparison communities. I will emphasise there that the number of stillbirths was very low overall, but we did see slightly higher rates in Oakey. In terms of developmental vulnerability, we looked at 5 different scales collected on the Australian Early Development Census. That's run every 3 years, so we had linkage to those results. And we found that in Oakey, 2 of the 5 categories, children were assessed as developmentally more likely to be assessed as developmentally vulnerable than the comparison communities. We didn't find any differences in Williamtown and Katherine on these measures to the comparison communities. We talked about the cancers, and finally the death outcomes. We looked at some specific causes. We looked at stroke, heart disease, liver and kidney diseases, so deaths due to those causes. And we found that in Oakey and Williamtown, there were higher rates of deaths due to coronary heart disease than in the comparison communities. I will add there that we also, sorry, go on.
No, sorry, I'm just listening. Sorry, yes, go on.
Yeah, I will add we did also look at what we call control outcomes. So their outcomes just to see, well, are we getting elevated rates for the things that we thought might be related to PFAS? Is that happening in other conditions we think are unlikely to be related to PFAS, which might give us an indication that the rates were going to be higher overall in those communities? So, for example, in Oakey, we did find higher rates also of deaths due to injuries, what we call external causes, which includes injuries, for instance. So, again, without wanting to cloud the picture too much, it's just an indicator that maybe there's other things going on driving higher rates of outcomes that are not just related to PFAS. Again, we're not ruling PFAS out as not being a cause, we just can't be confident of that link.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, and thank you for all of your work. I know it's been a very long and exhaustive process, and we do appreciate that.
Thank you, and yeah, just a couple of questions from myself, and I thank your team for this very, very comprehensive study. I think it's fantastic, the things that you've looked at and the study that you have put together. So I just want to confirm that across the PFAS affected communities compared with the control communities, there was no elevation in any of the disease or conditions that you examined that were common across all 3 PFAS communities. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And comparing people within those communities that had higher levels of PFAS in their blood or serum compared to those that didn't. Sorry, can you just confirm, were there any, again, across all 3 communities, were there any conditions that were statistically significantly higher in the people with PFAS in their serum compared to those who didn't?
No, we didn't see any, I'm pretty sure. Is that right, Nina?
Yes, Nina speaking. Yes, that's correct. Not in all 3 communities. We did see elevated uric acid in both Katherine and Williamtown, and also high prevalence of self-reported gout and kidney disease in Katherine and Williamtown, but these associations were not present in Oakey.
So, I mean, I guess, you know, whilst you can't necessarily rule out effects of PFAS, PFOS, etc., you certainly didn't find any statistically significant effects, particularly that were common across all the communities, all 3 communities where people had chemicals in their blood. Is that correct?
Yes.
Correct.
That's correct, other than mental health impacts, which we've discussed earlier.
So dealing with those psychological sort of traumas and stress and mental health impacts, given that they seem to be far in excess of any demonstrated physical effects, whilst they're very real, and I'm not discounting that, would they seem to be, perhaps slightly misplaced or over-exaggerated?
Look, I think, and we have investigated other environmental contamination events, and I think they're very consistent, actually. When you look at communities that have had environmental contamination and there's been, they're put in a situation they are not in control of it, see overt psychological distress. And I think it's, it's definitely something we've seen before, and it's experienced by communities where have these environmental contamination events.
And given the fact that your study didn't demonstrate any direct causal effects between contamination and disease consistently across communities, is there any scientific basis to actually recommend that people should not eat the produce, either animals or fruit and vegetables from their properties that are potentially contaminated?
Look, I would say that it's really a precautionary principle, and we realise that uncertainty is part of the problem here for local communities, and so not knowing whether there's a health effect or there isn't is one of the parts of the problem. And it's just good common sense to not actually expose yourself to chemicals if you don't know. And as I said before, the jury is still out on these chemicals' long-term health effects. And, there's going to be many more studies like this one coming out in future years. So I think while people will want to do that, I think it's something that we really have to think very carefully about.
So it's basically precautionary rather than based on any real known current risk.
Yeah, although I would point out that food regulators and water regulators are devising guidelines, and so they're doing it on the basis of the precautionary principle, and they take into account toxicological information and also epidemiological. So I think I'd be guided by them in terms of what's safe and appropriate.
And just on the question of the immunosuppression, I mean, you mentioned that, it would appear that now would be a very good time to look at that with the high vaccination rates going on. Is that a study that you would be placed to do, or is it just a hypothetical one that could be done by someone?
Look, I think there will be people around the world doing it. We're certainly interested in doing that type of study. But I think our research is often driven by the nature of funding and what we're able to do there, but it's certainly something we have thought about. And there's a huge amount of work going on to understand COVID as well as other vaccination issues. But I think PFAS has taken a bit of it hasn't been front of mind for public health for a couple of years. So I think it's certainly important, something that would be useful.
So is it something you would have the capacity to do if the funding was available?
Yes, potentially.
And finally, are there any other studies that you yourselves have identified that you would think beneficial following on from this study?
Well, it's an interesting one. I can't think of many. Certainly, in terms of what would be useful to these communities, and I can't think of any. I don't think longitudinal follow-up in the sense of following up rates of disease over time, apart from what Rosemary mentioned earlier about updating the data linkage in years to come. I wouldn't advocate that we start a cohort of people that have been exposed necessarily and look for their disease outcomes, because there's, I'm not convinced that's useful. So I can't really think of too many at the moment. I'd be interested in the views of others around the topic.
No, I think it'd be worthwhile, and I'm not across the 10 currently funded NHMRC studies that are being done, but I think they will cover a lot of the issues. But I think it's worth first and just reiterating that changing blood levels over time, I think is very important for these communities.
All right, well, unfortunately, look, we are out of time. But I would thank you all for your attendance today. And also, again, very much thank you for this very comprehensive study that you have done and published and made available to be here to discuss with us. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence when it becomes available, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. If you've agreed to provide any additional information today, we ask that you endeavour to get back to us by the 14th of January. And I now declare this meeting to be adjourned.